At this point, I am now going to hand over the baton to Carrie to introduce our next amazing speaker, Kris Newby. She has written some incredible books and produced some incredible documentaries, and has shedded a lot of light, and she writes like a thriller. I could not put the book down when I wrote it, and my husband felt the same way. So I'll let Carrie take it from here. So thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, you're right. So when I was reading Bitten, I was so excited for it to come out, first of all, because so many people talk about the whole conspiracy theory, you know, of ticks and where they come from and where they put here purposely and all of this stuff. So when Kris's book was announced, I was giddy. I could not wait to get through her book. Just something you all should know, last year at TikTok at Dickinson, we actually showed Under Our Skin. Kris's background is that, unfortunately, like many of us who dive into the Lyme world, it's because either we ourselves have been bitten or a family member has been bitten. And in Kris's case, she and her husband, they were vacationing in Martha's Vineyard here on the East Coast, even though she's from the West Coast or living in the West Coast, and she and her husband both became sick because they were bitten by ticks. And you know, Kris, by nature, she was formerly with Stanford University as a medical writer, and she has always done an incredible job in really articulating well, pen to paper, what is going on medically. And so for someone who's already embedded, excuse the pun, in Lyme, for her to be able to not only talk about her story, but then be so engaged with what's going on that she wants to be able to talk with others. And that's where Under Our Skin came in. It was with the Tribeca Film Festival. She was a senior producer on that. If you haven't watched Under Our Skin, I suggest you do so. We all have a lot of time, so maybe you can chill from Netflix and go watch that. But with her book, I just want to point out that it is just so tremendously written. If you think about sometimes when you're writing academically, you get caught up in some of the medical jargon and some of the things, and maybe you're not able to follow it as well. As Heather pointed out, it's like a thriller. So Kris, I would say that this should become a movie. I feel like it could be, because the way you drive this book and telling it about William Burgdorferi and from his perspective, and when you talked with his wife, it is just tremendous. So I want to thank you, Kris, so much for being here with us for TikTok. I certainly wish it would have been in person, but I'm thrilled to have you nonetheless. And with that said, I would like everyone to listen to Kris Newby, her presentation. Again, it's her book, Bitten. It's the secret history of Lyme disease and biological weapons. Thank you so much, Kris.
Thanks. I'm really excited here. I'm especially excited to hear about Andrew and Nicole's data, because I really love data. I'm an engineer by training. So before we start, I wanted to share a data visualization that I put together that you all might want to reference it sometime or the other. Share, hold on. Okay, is the sound okay, and can you see this map?
Yes, sound is great. We can see the map. You may want to make that full screen though.
Let's see. Well, I think I don't want to do it full.
Oh, I've got you. Yep, that should be fine, Kris.
Because I'm going to start the slideshow full screen. But the thing I wanted to point out was that this goes from 2000 to 2018, and you can see the Lyme disease outbreak started in two places. It started on the East Coast around Connecticut, and then in Wisconsin, Minnesota. And that's sort of important because the first biological weapons program sort of started at University of Wisconsin, run by a guy named Ira Baldwin. And so he did a lot of testing in that area. So just keep that in the back of your mind. But know that my book only focused on the Lyme, Connecticut area. So I did something a little different in this stay-at-home thing. I pre-recorded the audio on each slide. So I'm going to run through this. It'll be sort of tight, and just let me know if the sound is good, and then I'll answer questions on the fly afterwards. So let me start this. Oh yeah, and you can get to this map on my website, krisnewby.com. Okay, so now I'm going to start playing these. Here we go. Hello, my name is Kris Newby, and today I'm going to tell two stories. The first is the public-facing history of Lyme disease. It's a feel-good tale about heroic scientists and the miracle of antibiotics. The second is the secret backstory of this disease outbreak. It's a dark story, a story that some might label as conspiracy theory. But as a lover of facts, I'm an engineer by training and a science writer by profession. I'll be presenting my 5 years of book research, culled from recently declassified documents, original lab notes, interviews, and historical archives. Lyme became my favorite disease in 2002 after my husband and I were bitten by 2 unseen ticks on a tiny island just off Martha's Vineyard. After we returned to California, we came down with a flu-like illness. We spent the next year seriously ill, with brain fog, fatigue, pain, and the inability to function in the world. Our first 8 doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. They thought it was all in our heads. It took a year and $60,000 to discover that we had 2 common tick-borne diseases, Lyme and babesiosis. Then it took another 5 years to return to health. This started my epic quest to figure out why. Why are there no fast, accurate tests for Lyme disease 4 decades after its discovery? Why did the so-called experts say that Lyme is easy to cure when about 20% of the tick bit go on to become chronically ill? Why have public health officials largely ignored the alarming spread of tick-borne diseases? It didn't make sense to me, so I started digging. First, let's start with the official history of Lyme disease. In the mid-1960s, Polly Murray, a mother of 4, started documenting a mysterious disease outbreak in her town of Lyme, Connecticut. After 10 years of pleading for help, the CDC assigned Alan Steer, a freshly minted Yale physician, to investigate. 2 years after that, Steer published a paper hypothesizing that the disease was transmitted by ticks. And finally, in November 1981, Willy Burgdorfer, America's tick expert, started investigating. In 1982, 17 years after Polly raised alarms, Willy Burgdorfer identified the causative organism behind Lyme disease, a bacterium later named after him, Borrelia burgdorferi. And best of all, the medical experts said the disease could be cured with a few weeks of antibiotics. But still, I was left with the nagging questions. Why did this discovery take 17 years? My search for answers led me to filmmaker Andy Wilson, who was producing Under Our Skin, a documentary that shined a light on the plight of Lyme patients. During our 3.5 years of filming, I researched Lyme science and how profit motives and politics were making it harder for Lyme patients to be treated. But I was still puzzled by a few things. Why were the public health institutions so secretive about everything associated with this disease? No officials would go on camera. I was snubbed at scientific conferences. And it took the CDC 5.5 years to fulfill my Freedom of Information request related to researcher conflicts of interest. Then an interesting thing happened during the last year of filming. When we went to interview Willy Burgdorfer, now retired from the NIH, he contradicted what the government said about Lyme disease. He said a short course of antibiotics wouldn't always cure the disease, and that the disease was particularly harmful to the developing neurological systems of children. Right after the camera was turned off, he said, "I didn't tell you everything." And he refused to say more for 6 more years. Willy broke his silence in 2013 when an indie filmmaker got him to admit that he believed the outbreak of tick-borne diseases around Lyme, Connecticut was linked to a US bioweapons program. He said, "Accidents happen." A few months later, in a follow-up interview, he made more jaw-dropping admissions. He said he'd worked in the US bug-borne bioweapons program for decades. He put plague and fleas. He worked on mass-producing poison ticks so they could be dropped on enemies. Still, Willy was in his late 80s and had advanced Parkinson's disease. I know I needed more evidence to verify his claims. This was the start of 5 years of research that would go into Bitten. Now I'll start the secret backstory of the Lyme disease discovery. Most people don't know that our bioweapons program was almost as large as the nuclear weapons program, and it was just as secretive. In 1949, it employed about 13,000 employees. The program was managed at Camp Detrick, just outside of Washington, D.C., and the program called on all the major branches of the military, hundreds of industry contractors, and about 50 universities. The projects were compartmentalized, so many of the contractors didn't know the purpose behind the projects.
After World War II, the military learned more about the extensive bug-borne weapons program of the Germans and Japanese, and their paranoia grew. The Russians also had captured some of those scientists. They started looking for their own flea, tick, and mosquito experts, perhaps someone fluent in German, so that they could learn the skills from the Nazi biological weapons researchers, brought over through Operation Paperclip. Willie was the perfect fit. He had just received his doctoral degree in medical zoology at the Swiss Tropical Institute. He'd studied tick-borne relapsing fever and Q fever, a rickettsial-like organism used as a biological weapon. So in 1952, Willie started a 2-year fellowship at Rocky Mountain Labs in Hamilton, Montana, and he married a local girl. Rocky Mountain Lab was founded in 1928 to study the most deadly tick-borne disease in the US, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, a rickettsia bacterium. During the Cold War, they maintained a tick hatchery with species from around the world. The staff also produced yellow fever vaccines for the military. Willie began his bioweapons career as soon as he received his security clearance. His kickoff meeting was with UK and Canadian experts in entomological weapons at the Suffield Experimental Station near Calgary, Canada. He also worked as a contractor for the bioweapons program on site at Dietrich for months at a time. Willie supported the tick weaponization program with a series of experiments where he force-fed ticks with a variety of deadly disease agents. He fed them through glass capillary tubes. He force-fed ticks with Q fever, tularemia, leptospira, equine encephalitis virus, Asiatic relapsing fever, rickettsia prowazekii, and the rabies virus. He worked on Colorado tick fever virus and tested a vaccine on Montana prisoners. The Dietrich weapons designers were looking for ticks that could be dropped on an enemy without arousing suspicion, filled with agents for which the target population wouldn't have immunity. This is what makes the COVID-19 virus so devastating. When a population is exposed to a brand new virulent germ, death and sickness will follow. Ticks were the perfect stealth weapon, untraceable and incapacitating. During my research, I interviewed 3 participants in the weaponized tick program, including a CIA contractor who in 1962 dropped 2 boxes of infected ticks on Cuban sugarcane workers. The goal of this pilot study, under the umbrella of Operation Mongoose, was to weaken the workers in the Cuban economy so that the citizens would be motivated to overthrow dictator Fidel Castro. It didn't work. Willie's first project was force-feeding fleas with bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, caused by a bacterium that has killed millions over the history of mankind. Willie worked on efficient ways to raise, infect, and store infected fleas in bomblets so that they could be dropped over battalion-sized areas from airplanes. At the time of these experiments, Willie had 2 infant sons at home, and it brings new meanings to the trying not to bring your work home at night phrase. The Army would load the flea canisters in M114 munitions, then drop them from planes. The bomblets would explode at a set altitude and rain fleas down on a battalion-sized area. Field testing was conducted at Camp Dugway, Utah, which is about 50 miles as the crow flies from Salt Lake City, Utah. It's important to note that the biological and chemical weapons program conducted tens of thousands of experiments all around the US before they perfected their experiments. In this talk, I'm focusing only on the bug-borne weapons, but there are other experiments, most of which are still classified, that will have long-term effects on our environment. I have documentation of tick or tick disease field studies being conducted in Virginia, Maryland, Utah, Alaska, Montana, Hawaii, and Florida, but I'm sure there are more. And that's why we need public disclosure on this. It will save research dollars and lives. For this Dugway field test, called Operation Big Itch, cages loaded with guinea pigs were spread out over a circular test pattern. Over 500,000 uninfected fleas were packed into the bomblets and dropped on 125 guinea pigs. After analysis, it was determined only 177 fleas found their way to the guinea pigs, and the rest hopped off into the desert. In addition, some of the airplane crew reported having flea bites. Nevertheless, the Army declared the experiment a success. In addition, the bioweapons designers began mass producing microbes outside of bugs so that they could be freeze-dried into spores and sprayed over large areas to kill or chronically incapacitate. Sometimes they'd mix bacterial agents with viruses so that resulting mixed infections would be hard to diagnose and treat. And many of the microbes, once deployed and inhaled by animals on the ground, could be spread by ticks taking a blood meal. This experiment was one of many funded through Project 112, the large area coverage program. The goal was to spray biological agents over city-sized areas from planes, ships, and vehicles. For most bioweapons, the military developed vaccines to protect their own soldiers. These were tested on both animals and human volunteers, mostly Seventh-day Adventists, in the 8-Ball at Camp Dietrich, a 1 million liter steel gas chamber. The Army also funded studies on weaponized ticks that could survive in the cold climates of the Soviet Union. I presume this is why they started working with aggressive swarming Lone Star ticks. These ticks can live in a freezer for a month and underwater for 70+ days. Unlike deer ticks, they have simple eyes, so they can stalk their prey. In a series of experiments in the late 1960s, ticks were made radioactive so that their spread could be tracked over months and years using a Geiger counter-like device. Lone Star ticks, which recently have been found to cause red meat allergies, were released in an uncontrolled manner in coastal Virginia on the Atlantic bird flyway that runs from South America up through Canada. Before military testing, Lone Stars were only found in the southern states, but 2 years after these experiments ended, established colonies of Lone Stars were first identified on Long Island. This brings me back to Willie's premise and the central question of my book. Was the outbreak around Lyme, Connecticut sparked by a bioweapons release? Many people don't know that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, was originally established as an organization that protects our country from biological weapons attacks. When it investigates an unusual disease outbreak, their EIS officers look for clues on whether it's natural or man-made. Top signs that it's an unnatural event include a large number of dead and sick animals, including people, an unusual disease not seen in the area before, a point source of origin that includes multiple epidemics. So we see in the late 60s, there were 3 uncommon, fairly deadly tick-borne diseases that all of a sudden appeared around Long Island Sound. There was a new disease, Lyme arthritis, first identified in Lyme, Connecticut at the top of the triangle. There was a deadly spotted fever rickettsia, killing people on Long Island. And there was a first-in-man cattle parasite, babesia, seen for the first time in the eastern US on the islands off Massachusetts, near Plum Island, our anti-animal bioweapons facility at the time. My hypothesis is this: in the late 60s, there was a perfect storm of events that fueled our current epidemic of tick-borne diseases. First, there was a series of uncontrolled field tests of airborne, possibly engineered rickettsial and viral agents, where some escaped. Second, there was an uncontrolled release of non-native Lone Star ticks that hastened the spread of these diseases. And finally, there was a government cover-up associated with this release, resulting in a hyper-focus on Lyme disease and a minimization of the impact of the viral and rickettsial co-infection, for which there are no ready tests. Willie, who was in charge of rickettsial disease outbreaks at the time, raised the alarm about the spike in rickettsial cases that appeared at the height of the US airborne biological weapons program. And he discovered a mysterious rickettsial agent in almost all of the Lyme, Connecticut patient blood samples he received from Alan Steer of Yale. This discovery was never mentioned after 1980, and he told me he was asked to bury this finding. What's more, there were an unusual number of animal and people deaths in the late 60s during this time period. Hundreds of horses and pheasants died of what was attributed to equine encephalitis, a known bioweapon, and duck plague, an agent that was being studied at nearby Plum Island. The duck industry of Long Island was decimated after this outbreak. So one possibility that I'm still investigating is that there was some sort of accidental release of viral agents out of Fort Dix, located in North New Jersey off the tip of Long Island in 1964. The military sacrificed thousands of birds and vaccinated soldiers to try and control the release before it became public. Polly Murray's whistleblowing in Lyme, Connecticut blew that strategy, so the CDC mounted a public investigation. Willie discovered the undocumented Swiss agent rickettsia was everywhere, and because it was a possible bioweapon from the leak, it was buried. Perhaps the Lyme bacteria discovery was a misdirection. Have the infected take doxycycline. It kills both rickettsias and the Borrelia bacterium, and people will get over the other virus on their own. This brings me to the central question of this presentation. Was Willie telling the truth? Scientists are trained to report all observations, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. To omit an important observation is in essence a scientific lie. It undermines the very foundation of all future research. The secrecy associated with Lyme disease in the name of national security has harmed millions. Research funding has been restricted to the few number of scientists with security clearances who are protected by their willingness to perpetuate the lies. Now, as the multiple levels of lies associated with Lyme disease becomes heavy, the penalty for telling the truth also grows. The complicit are afraid. Fear of lawsuits, fear of the loss of reputation, fear of the new technologies and research that will ultimately reveal the truth. I believe that we're not dealing with an easy to treat and cure disease. We're dealing with multiple weaponized microbes, and we need the best and brightest scientists to help cure the afflicted. I'll add one last note on the profit motive of discovering a new disease, which I discovered in my documentary and which could apply to the COVID-19 pandemic. When a scientist at a university or a government institution identifies a gene sequence that could be used as a marker in a test kit or an injectable in a vaccine, the scientist and the employer can receive royalties on that patent if it is commercialized and sold. For example, if a CDC researcher patents an idea for a COVID-19 vaccine, he or she can earn up to $150,000 per year in royalties, and that person's employer can earn a negotiated percentage of the vaccine profits. I have no problem with scientists being rewarded for their ingenuity, but there's a dark side to this system when scientists err on the side of protecting their royalties over being unbiased arbiters of scientific truth. I saw this with Lyme disease, when the owner of vaccine and test kits wrote force of law guidelines that favored their inventions over new technologies from competitors. I'll end this presentation with a call to action to the people in the audience, researchers and patients, and politicians. There's still a lot of work to be done with the tick-borne disease epidemic. To researchers, fire up your genomic sequencers to help find out what's in the ticks and where these germs came from. To epidemiologists, factor in the military dissemination of the novel germs when studying the spread of tick diseases. To politicians, we need to know where the bioweaponized germs were released and what protective measures were developed by the military. And then to patients, find physicians experienced in diagnosing and treating mixed tick co-infections. It's more than just Lyme disease. So thank you.
Let's see now.
All right.
I'm done.
Okay, that's great. So Kris, I don't have questions coming up in the question and answer panel just yet, but I know we have lots of questions for you as well. Why don't you, I so appreciate the book, and I actually was just for work at Fort Detrick a month or so ago, and almost reached out to you to say, I feel like I'm going into the scene of the crime. There was a lovely group I was working with there, but understanding more about this. So what for you, what were some of the most shocking things that you uncovered, and what lessons, I know you shared that a bit in your presentation, but what lessons or information do you think people can take away from this around Lyme disease and infectious diseases in general?
You know, I think the magnitude of the bug-borne weapons program and tick-borne weapons program was sort of shocking. The fact that there were so many uncontrolled experiments, like when I fact-checked these at the end with tick researchers, they were saying, no, they didn't release those lone stars, radioactive lone stars. No, they didn't. I said, well, yeah, they did. It's been published. So to me, it was interesting that the government had released information about the weaponized fleas and the weaponized mosquitoes, but all the tick stuff hadn't been disclosed until the book came out. Mm-hmm. And I think it really is so important for all of us to know it, because before this, epidemiologists are just applying the old rules to tick and tick-borne diseases, that there would be some sort of predictable spread, and it's because of, climate change or growth of urban areas. But this is just like another complicating factors that epidemiologists and state health people need to know in this spread, that maybe the vector is not a bird or a deer or a tick, but it's men in uniforms from military planes. Or, for example, there were even open air bacteria tests in the Pennsylvania tunnels. They had trucks rigged with sprayers. This was in the 60s, I think.
That is frightening to even consider. We do have a question coming in as well. Do you think the truth will ever be acknowledged by the CDC or the US government?
I mean, I don't know. I've been trying for 5 years to file Freedom of Information requests, and a lot of them most of them get rejected when I request something at the heart of the matter. They say, that, like, I requested for information on the aerosol test for Venezuelan equine encephalitis and rickettsials. And they said there's an experiment. They were testing to see how the particles spread through dense forests. And they said, well, that document is declassified, but you can't see it because of national security. So I get kind of responses like that. Or with the CDC, they'll take years to fulfill it, and then I won't get the information.
Thank you. Carrie.
Yeah, Kris, of course, I loved hearing all of this. Again, there's some pieces that I sort of had forgotten about, and I went, oh yeah, that's right. I know how I felt when I was reading it. I'm always curious with Willy-Burg-Dörfrei, when there's that time frame where there's that lost bit of information, that lost bit of anything. Do you feel like we're ever going to learn about why that is? I mean, he took a lot to the grave, but do you think there's going to be a place for us to be able to learn some of that?
It's just hard to say. When the book came out, there a lot of whistleblowers have come forward. So so each of those tips, I just try to follow through and verify it with government documents. So it's just hard to say. A lot of that generation are dying.
Yeah,
that's the problem.
Yeah. Now, do you feel like maybe in the next couple of years, perhaps even because of what everyone is going through with COVID, I feel like worldwide, when there is a lack of understanding in any sort of disease that's driven, more people start to talk about it. In the Lyme world, we felt like it was just, a few of us, and we were in this group of black sheep. But in the wake of COVID, when there's a lot more discussion about testing and is it good testing and all of that, do you think some of that momentum will help later on with folks who have been more quiet in the Lyme world, people who know things? And having said that, would you then be driven to potentially continue what you've done and written even a Bitten too?
I think with the COVID thing, there's a dawning realization that Homo sapiens aren't necessarily at the top of the food chain, that we're vulnerable to these little microbes. And it also is pointing to some of the flaws in the CDC system, the way the CDC sort of is narrowing the definition of COVID and bungled the test. There was a perfectly good test from Europe, and they said, no, not invented here. We need to do our own. I wonder, is there any kind of profit motive in there? So everyone with Lyme has a healthy respect now for the power of infectious diseases. So I think there's a dawning of that with everyone now. And, I don't think Lyme disease, well, people aren't caring about Lyme awareness this month, which is understandable. But what was the last half of the question?
Well, I think I was just kind of pointing to, as people are maybe more interested in talking about these things, like you just said, COVID kind of opens up another dialogue of what's lacking in testing and things like that. And perhaps those have been more closed mouthed might offer more information. The CDC exposure of not always having proper testing and things there's more exposure with that, with COVID. So my thing was, would you continue on, and are you thinking of continuing on and maybe writing a second book should you find out more information?
Well, right now the book has been optioned by a couple filmmakers in Manhattan. And so we're putting together the plans for a documentary now on that. So I am continuing the research to try to get some closure on some of the things, the loose ends in the book.
So Kris, we are getting some questions in the Q&A panel, and some also kudoses and praise to you in the chat. So one question was, what keeps you from throwing your hands up in the air when faced with so much opposition?
I would say when I was writing the book, I was a little paranoid, and it was a very dark subject, and people, I just couldn't talk about it. So it was hard to have had that disease and been so sick, and then hear from someone, a scientist like Willy Burgdorfer, who knows the disease better than anyone, is like, you might not ever get rid of it, So I would say that was super hard. But I find it a fascinating history, and I just find that it isn't just like one of those things that was done in the Cold War that we can say, well, that was just the Cold War. What happened in the Cold War stays in the Cold War, because the accidents that happened during the Cold War with tick-borne diseases has lasting effect. I say in the book, it's like the American Chernobyl. It's whatever got out is in the ecosystem, and it's spreading like a bullseye out from Long Island up through Maine and now Canada, and into Canada through the other hot spot, which is Wisconsin. So it's information. It's just not esoteric history. It's stuff we really need to know now to help save people's lives and fix the problem. And then so I guess that's the answer. Yeah.
Great, thank you. One more question that's come through is, Kris, can you tell me what year Willy Burgdorfer was in Suffield, Alberta, if you know that? Thank you.
Yes, so Willy came over from Switzerland on Christmas Eve in 1951, and then mid-1952, he drove up from Montana to Suffield, and that's where they had the kickoff meeting for the US's bug-borne weapons program. So at the time, the UK was way ahead on biological weapons. They had been interviewing the Germans and scientists. We interviewed the Japanese scientists, and we were terrified at the level of sophistication of their bioweapons program. So the US decided to play catch up, and that's why Willy's salary was funded and why this meeting was funded in Suffield. So Suffield is like the test field. It's the equivalent of our Dugway Proving Grounds up there. And they tested sarin and I think anthrax up there. And Willy learned some strategy and some techniques, and then came back down and started, in the early 50s through the 60s, working on this program.
Thank you. And then some of the praise.
I'll just add one thing.
Sure.
Australian joined. This was called the tripartite program. So it's UK, the US, and Canada. And Australia joined, I think, late 50s, early 60s. So I suspect there was some testing in Australia too. But I haven't had time to look into that.
Well, we do have Australia on the phone in the call today too, some folks from Australia representing. And I do know we're getting more and more people active in Australia trying to find ways to help the people who are being diagnosed with Lyme disease there too. So that would make a lot of sense. Two more questions are coming in for you. Do you think starting a petition nationally to demand the release of bug bioweapons information would be effective?
I think that would help. Maybe people don't know that in July, Representative Kris Smith in New Jersey added an amendment to the defense appropriation bill to investigate into tick-borne weapons for the reasons I talked about. And it got killed at the last minute in December for unknown reasons. And that was going to allow us to really have the US disclose what, where, and when was released. So I think a petition could help because Freedom of Information Acts have been fairly worthless so far for me. A lot of the places I got the information, I probably visited 20 historical archives, and whenever the government did anything, they filed stuff in triplicate in different agencies. So part of the thing is find out someone who's died, who's donated their papers to an archive, and go look through them, and you just piece together all the evidence like a 1,000-piece puzzle. And sometimes you can get a pretty clear picture on what the programs were, even though they were classified in little teeny compartments.
It's like putting the pieces of the puzzle together, really, from all of that. Yeah. I'm getting a few more questions. So from reading the book, I'm a little confused. Is the long-lasting illness of Lyme disease caused from Borrelia or the Swiss agent? What are your thoughts on that?
So this is sort of a confusing thing that was when Kris Smith waved Bitten around. The press sort of ran with it without reading the book and saying, oh, well, Lyme disease can never be a bioweapon because we found it in an Iceman, in Europe during the ice ages. So in my book, and it seems what Willie was telling me, though he wasn't 100% disclosing, is that Borrelia was not the weapon that he was worried about. He was in charge of rickettsia research in the US then, and he feels like it was this bioweaponized rickettsial that was the problem that he was told to bury. Just from a practical standpoint, I mean, when I never found evidence of Borrelia burgdorferi, the Lyme disease bacterium, being developed as a bioweapon, because it would take, years to develop a specific germ for bioweaponization that could be deployed. Borrelia is too hard to culture, as most of the people here know. Culturing, you couldn't grow it, and it's slow growing. You couldn't grow it in mass quantities, but rickettsials and viruses like VEE, you could grow lots of them, and then you could freeze dry them and spray them all over the place. So the thing that I don't get too deeply into in talks is this thing about Swiss agent. An outstanding mystery that I don't know if I'll ever get an answer to is this outbreak around Long Island had this mysterious rickettsial, and all of a sudden Willie, in the middle of this epidemic, was sent to Switzerland for 8 months, and he collected ticks there. And this mysterious rickettsial only tested positive to this European strain. So, why was he sent over there? It was almost like they knew that this germ was what was in Switzerland, on the German and French border. So was it like a Nazi germ? I don't know. That's one of those questions. I don't know if it'll ever be answered.
Another question in chat was, do you think Dr. Willie Burgdorfer died from the testing that he was doing? Did he get exposed to Lyme disease and the other diseases that he was weaponizing the ticks with? Do you think that may have been what caused his death?
When he first took over the rickettsial as rickettsial chief at Rocky Mountain Labs, he did get rickettsials, and he was sick for what seems like about a month, but he seemed to get over it. Then right after his discovery of the spirochete, the Lyme spirochete, which was in 1982, he was running tests and rerunning tests and at Rocky Mountain Lab. And on Sundays, the lab techs wouldn't come in, so he went to change the rabbit cages that he was using for experiments. And he says that some of the infected urine splashed in his eyes, and he got Lyme disease there. So he did have Lyme disease for quite a while, and then he came down with Parkinson's. He seemed to think that the Parkinson's was caused by the Lyme disease, but he said, how do we tell?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Goodness. All right, we're getting one more question in the Q&A. As a social media influencer with Lyme disease, what are some things I can do to raise awareness about the realities of Lyme disease? So many are suffering in silence. I want to use my platform to help. And Carrie, you may want to pop in on this as well. But Kris, just thoughts around any of the social media influencers we have out there, people who are suffering. What are some of the suggestions that you would give on how they can use their platforms to help raise awareness and to help others who are suffering?
Well, you know, I've been in the fight since 2002. It's just really a hard slog because the people who control the information are the sort of the disease founders, the old dudes, and they're sort of stuck on their way of thinking about the disease, easy to treat, easy to cure. But I just think everybody has special talents, and once you, for Lyme patients anyways, once you get over the illness, you just look at your special skills and, you know, slowly try to help people. Like I help patients every week. I have like my Lyme 911 tips that I give out to them so that I can help them get to the right doctor as soon as possible. Some people like Carrie are helping people afford treatment, which, you know, since mainstream medical institutions aren't accepting a lot of chronic Lyme patients, and it's super expensive to do any of that outside of the system. So helping those people get treatment so you can get more healthy people to spread the word. You know, unfortunately, the epidemic's so big now that everybody knows somebody who has Lyme disease, and you know, we just need to increase the number of people who are become evangelists to the reality of the disease.
Thank you. Carrie, do you have anything else that you might want to add to that as well?
Yeah, I do. You know, first of all, it is really valuable that when you are well and you come out of your, you know, like for my daughter, when she finally had her voice back, instead of feeling like, you know, she still had that monkey on her back of being sick, she was able to really have more compassion and understanding and empathize with folks who are going through it, because so many people are still feeling like they can't really talk to loved ones and even family members. There's still a big stigma attached to those who are sick with Lyme because it permeates a person in so many different ways than the person standing next to you. For me, because my background is in television and being able to use my voice and my face to explain what has happened with our family and to talk to people about prevention, if you're able to tap into the areas in your community that are either broadcasting radio stations, things like that, if you don't have a network, like here we have PA Lyme, and that's a huge network that really helps push legislation, and they get grants to do a lot of education packets. So they're a great resource. And so people who are so inclined, they can start getting with the different organizations in their area to what fits for them. So for me, I really wanted to push the mission of being able to help people afford their Lyme disease treatment, because so many people say, hey, that's great, you're giving me all this information and where to go, but I don't have any money to do so. So in your area, if you can support an organization that is pushing fundraising, call them, email them and say, what can I do as a volunteer? Again, if you have an organization that does a lot more on legislation and a lot more on education, maybe if you know you're an educator yourself and you want to bring it to your school district, reach out that way. I think that when you're just a person who's a social media influencer, you do have great power with your voice. And so maybe looking at all of the different organizations that are pushing out incredible information, whether it's, like I said, your statewide organization, there's other organizations like Live Lyme Foundation. They have incredible graphics. And really look at what you want your voice to represent and kind of stay in that lane. And I really appreciate the people who are willing to do that and put themselves out there. There are people all across the country, all across the world that I even look to see the information that they are providing. And so I do appreciate that question. I do appreciate the people that really want to be stewards of the information.
Great. And Kris, this is a question to you, separate from being an author that's investigated this, but as a Lyme warrior yourself, you mentioned your your Lyme 911 that you offer to people. If you could give advice to other people who are joining us that have been battling Lyme and weren't getting the answers. I believe the way you've battled Lyme is the same way that you have, you tackle many things in your life. You're an investigative journalist, really, and you continued to investigate until you got proper diagnosis um, and that you were tenacious in that and in your healing. So I just don't know if you have any advice that you would give to others here that are on the call that might feel that they're not being heard and they're not getting the answers that they need.
I think you need to hold on to hope, because I feel like my husband and I were so sick, and we gutsed it out and got better. And I mean, there's no way when I was in the depth of despair, I thought I could ever write again. I thought I would never work again. So just keep at it. Know that there'll be ups and downs in your treatment. And then the advice I give to everybody is get to a Lyme specialist as soon as you can, even if it's expensive for now. Because, for example, if you had like an aggressive brain tumor, you would look for the doctor who had treated that specific tumor successfully. So find someone who can recognize co-infections, because it's not just Lyme. Like the combination of Lyme plus the other co-infections can be really, really hard to get through and hard on your body. So, find a good captain to lead you through that dark tunnel.
And then a final question that I was receiving is because of the testing, the bioweapon testing that was happening, injecting several different tick-borne diseases, do you think part of the reason that it's difficult to diagnose Lyme properly is because there are so many different diseases that are in there that it's masking that? Or do you think it's an issue with the testing itself? What are your thoughts around the repercussions of the testing and the impact on the ability to diagnose properly today?
Part of it is our profit-driven medical system that by law, I think, requires you to test one disease with one test. And then the other thing is we don't have ready available tests for a lot of the co-infections. What needs to happen is, when you're bitten by a tick and you get sick, you should take your blood and run it through a 96 well of all the, the common tick-borne diseases all at once. And then, because not one drug treats all of these microbes, so you need to know what drugs to use and what order to treat them in. So part of it's, we need gang tests for the common multiple tick infections. And then there's the problem with CDC testing, which, it was flawed from the beginning for a bunch of reasons. It's complicated. It would take me a while to explain it, but it's flawed. Many smart people in the CDC know that. And so we need to get the new technologies out there. It's a very old test, antibody test. So it shows if you've had the disease rather than if you have it now. And the current testing scheme doesn't work in the first month. So it's a catch-22 disease with Lyme disease. The test doesn't work in the first month. And then by the time the test does work, you may have embedded serious Lyme along with co-infections.
Well, Kris, we have, Carrie popped in. Do you want to add anything, Carrie, before I go to one more option in the chat here?
I just thought of something. I remember when I was reading the book, and I think this was with you, Kris. I can't remember, but it was talking about testing and how difficult it is with, the current testing that we have right now, and how great it would be if we could test the blood for just the what's going on instead of the antibodies made. Do you think that on the horizon there could be something out there that has like our skin responds to a mosquito bite and we immediately feel that? Do you think there could be something on the horizon that would benefit us that way, where we could actually feel a tick bite? We could feel that happening, because we know we can't because of that numbing agent they put in. But you think that that could be something that would be worthy, where we would have a sense of it being there and happening and be able to more quickly remove it?
I think that's a really good idea, because then, you know, you can pull them off before anything is transmitted into your bloodstream. So I don't know if anybody's working on that particularly. I know there's someone working on some sort of agent against the tick saliva, but I can't remember who it is.
All right, and Kris, I just got a lovely message in chat that I want to make sure that you see, and I think this is from Tiffany in chat, that I want to think this reflects for all of us. Thank you so much for this work that you're doing and your bravery. This is not something that people wanted investigated, and your courage and your bravery to bring this to the light, I think, is going to be able to help many people have a greater understanding of why this is happening and why it's hard to diagnose, and what might this lead to help us understand other diseases, infectious diseases that we're battling. So thank you so much for your courage, for your bravery, for your tenacity. I will say, in the book, when you were in Utah and they come down on the porch from the cabin, that I was just, you know, frightened for you and with you. I know that it had nothing to do with the research that you were doing. But that struggle and fear, I think, was really validated. So thank you for your courage to bring this information to the light. We look forward. I don't know if that was a new awareness to everyone that you are in conversation. It's the first I've heard around the rights for the book to become a movie. I think it's great. Here's just a fun question to ask you. Who do you think should play you in the movie version of Bitten?
Well, it's a documentary right now.
Oh, documentary. Okay. All right.
And we have started.
So you'll play you. Yeah.
Yes, we have started pre-production. We're just looking for a streaming, like Netflix, a streamer who will put the big money into it. But I don't know who would play me. I'm not sure.
Give that some thought. You can let us know that later.
Listen, I said in the beginning when I teed her up, I was like, this could be a movie. It's that much of a thriller, and uncover this and then get to this. So I don't know, Kris, I'm gonna think about that for you, because I feel like in my back of my mind, I mean, like Renee Zellweger might be good for you. That might be a good fit.
Interesting. I love it.
I will say this. I'm thrilled to know that the documentary is the potential for that. I think it's wonderful that people are really looking at what you're writing and taking it to heart and being able to present it. And I wish you so much luck with that. I'll be, one of your biggest cheerleaders when that comes out. So even though I read the book, I'll be all over that documentary.
Thanks. All right.
And Kris, just what is on the horizon? Oh, we're getting Reese Witherspoon is one of the suggestions as well. So just putting it out there.
Suggested too.
Yeah. So
she has her own production company too.
She does. That is a real advantage. And she loves strong women characters. So I think this could work. Any plans for Under Our Skin? Anything else happening with that you'd like to share before we move on to our afternoon break?
So Andy Wilson is a producer there. He's playing with a third film, but he's in the middle of a movie about the Korean dog meat industry now, so he's busy with that.
Interesting with all that's happening with how we understand the spread of coronavirus. I've worked in Uganda, Africa for years, and the spread of Ebola, looking at eating of animals and that passing on to humans. So that's interesting that he's doing. So thank you so much, Kris. We so appreciate you, our early riser coming from Palo Alto, California. So it's much earlier there than on the East Coast for everyone. So we appreciate you joining and sharing your time with us. I do so wish that you and Carrie could have met in person. I did have the privilege of doing that in Colorado at the Live Lyme Summit as well. But we're so blessed to have you in our community. We wish you ongoing health and wellness. And we look forward to whatever you choose to investigate next. I know that it will lead to answers and truth, which I think is what we all want in the world right now.